right. Well, it's a couple minutes past 7 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get this second virtual Science Club meeting started tonight. I wanted to, before I turn it over to Dr. Tessa Burch-Smith and introduce her, we do have just a couple of announcements about the science fair. And Kim and Jan, I just wanted to see if you have anything just in general to say. I was just going to give a few updates on deadlines and those sort of things just to remind everyone. But is there anything else you want to add?
No, just that this is a great time to ask questions if they need to have anything answered about the science fair. And we'll be around at the end of the meeting to see if anybody has any questions.
Okay, all right, well, just to get all of the not fun things out of the way, deadlines and such, before we turn it over to Dr. Burch-Smith. I just wanted to remind everyone that SASEF, the Southern Appalachian Science and Engineering Fair, the premier fair for East Tennessee. Registration is actually open now, so you can start to go ahead and register. I would recommend doing it soon. If you're a teacher, you'll need to register as a teacher, and if you're a student, you'll need to register your project. The sooner you do that, the better, and the reason for that is because once you register, we can give you updates and make sure you're getting like weekly updates on where your project is, what else you need to do to make sure you're ready to go for the fair. So register now, make sure you do that soon. If your project involves any kind of human subjects or animals or anything that may be deemed dangerous whatsoever, so like a fire or something like that, you do have to make sure you get pre-approved before you start your project. So just keep in mind that deadline that you have to get it done by January 15th. But we recommend you do it as soon as you can so you can get started on your project as soon as you can. And then the final deadline looking forward to closer to the fair is February 28th. That's when you'll need to have all your project paperwork and all that turned in. And then the event itself, if you hadn't heard already, I know a lot of folks were here last week, but just as a reminder, the event itself is going to be a virtual fair this year. So the virtual event will be held March 29th and March 30th. It won't be in Thompson Bowling Arena like it has been in the past, but will be held virtually online. And we'll share details on that as we get a little bit closer. But in general, if you have any questions, the first thing you can do is go to sasef.utk.edu, and you can find a lot of that information I just shared there. But if you can't find it there, certainly you can contact us. The email address to reach us at's listed on the page there, prep@utk.edu, or you can call that phone number there. And you're probably going to get me if you do that, and I'm happy to help. But without any further ado, I do want to turn over the floor. Actually, I would like to introduce her first. So today we have Dr. Tessa Burch-Smith with us. She is an associate professor of biochemistry and cellular and molecular biology at the University of Tennessee here in Knoxville. So she's going to share a lot about her experiences as faculty, how she got there, and then a little bit more. So Tessa, go right ahead.
Thank you very much, Jason. Everybody hearing me okay? Yep.
I can hear you.
Great. So I'm going to be a little ageist and ask if the young students could turn on their cameras so that I can see you as I'm speaking to you, if you do not mind. So just right. Yeah, I just want to see a few of you so I can get a sense of who I'm talking to. Thank you very much. So thank you very much to Jason and the other organizers for inviting me to present to you today. This is one of the most fun activities that we as faculty participate in, talking to young people who are interested in becoming scientists, or even those of you who just have an interest in science. Okay, so I'm Dr. Tessa Burch-Smith. You can call me Tessa, that's fine. And I put my email address up here in case you think of anything that you'd like to email me about after the presentation tonight, okay? So tonight is gonna be, I'm not talking about any science in detail, but I was given a list of questions by Jason, and I'm gonna try to answer them with this short presentation tonight. And I hope you get a better feeling of how one becomes actually a professor, which is what I am. But we learn a little more about science, how we do science, and how do you stay engaged in science, okay? So, I was born in the Caribbean. You can tell from my accent, I don't sound like an American. I certainly don't sound like I'm from Tennessee. And somehow in the first grade, I got this idea that I was going to become a scientist. So this was perhaps very surprising. To me, it made perfect sense, right? But I don't know if you know anything about St. Lucia, if you've ever even heard of St. Lucia before. That's the country that I'm from. Anybody heard of it before? No, right? You have, Erin. Good. Okay, so this is a world map. And you can recognize big countries, right? This is where I'm from. I'm from one of these little dots on a map that nobody pays any attention to. Tiny island. It's in the part of the world called the Caribbean. So we're not too far from the United States. If you can see, there's Miami right here. You have Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and then you have all these islands. And I am from this one right here, St. Lucia. So between Martinique and St. Vincent, which may mean nothing to you. And this is what St. Lucia looks like. So this is a close-up map of St. Lucia. The size of St. Lucia is shockingly small. It's 238 square miles. We have a population of about 182,000 people. And for comparison, the population of Knoxville is 192,000. So our whole country has fewer people than Knoxville does, okay? And this is not Knox County, this is Knoxville proper. But here's a fun fact. St. Lucia has the highest density of Nobel Prize winners in the world. If there were 10 million people in St. Lucia, 111 of them would have won Nobel Prizes. That's the highest rate in the world. So for our population of 182,000 people, we've managed to produce 2 Nobel Prize winners so far. So one for economics and another one for literature. So we're quite proud of that fact because we're small and inconsequential, but that doesn't mean we don't have something to contribute on the international stage, right? So right there is take-home message number 1. Don't feel insignificant. You never know what you have to contribute. So this is these are a few images I took to show you a flavor of life in St. Lucia. So it's a tropical island, volcanic, and our main industry now is tourism. You can go on the internet and find all these beautiful pictures of the pitons and all the lush tropical forests and all of that. This is the market, Castries Market on a Saturday morning. You go and you buy your produce fresh from the farmers who've come to town. So a lot of agriculture going on there. And this is one of the more developed parts of the island, showing the big hotels on the beaches and fancy homes and marinas. So very picturesque. And in the background, this is where I started my education. So this image here, this is me right here, if you couldn't tell. And these are 3 of my colleagues, 3 of my classmates who remain some of my best friends today. So this is Aisha, Janelle, and Lavin. The island is so small that Lavin is also my first cousin, but we ended up in school for about 10 years together. We were in class together and even sat next to each other for a while. So it's a small place. We meet the same people over and over again. And St. Lucians love to have fun. So this is a picture actually. 2 of these young ladies are my daughters. So we do carnival where we put on our costumes and we dance and we have lots of fun. So it's a small island, very different culture from Knoxville, and I had a wonderful time growing up there. But remember I said I wanted to be a scientist, right? So how could I be a scientist in St. Lucia, there's one main problem, which is that there's no university on the island. So the first decision I had to make was I had to recognize that I had to leave St. Lucia if I was going to be a scientist. There's no university, so can't study science to become a scientist if there's nowhere to study. So the first thing I did, after I completed my high school, I did my A-levels, which there's no real US equivalent because our education system is modeled on the British system. So I did my A-levels in St. Lucia at this community college. And after that, I moved to the University of the West Indies in Barbados, which is a neighboring island, where I did my Bachelor's of Science. So I was so intent on being a scientist, I didn't even care what kind of science I studied. So I did a degree in biology and one in chemistry, and I did them at the same time. So I have Bachelor's of Science in biology and chemistry. And it's a small island, small university, but I made the best of it. So when I was finished with my bachelor's, I decided I needed to do a PhD. And I'll tell you a little fun story about how clueless I was. So I told you that there was no university in St. Lucia. So I decided I wanted to apply to university in the US. But I only knew a few schools. So I moved back to St. Lucia after my degree, and I had saved up some money. So I had to buy a computer and get internet installed at my home because we didn't have it at the time. And then I decided I would go and download some forms from some places I had heard of. So I was so, what should I say? I was so clueless about all these things that I didn't even know what a PDF file was. So I was only able to apply to schools when I clicked on the link. I could actually see the form and just enter my information right there. I didn't even know that a PDF would be downloaded and you'd have to open it up. Anyway, long story short, I applied to 4 grad schools in the US. And lo and behold, one of them accepted me, and that was Yale University. So as clueless as I was, I had done enough work in my undergraduate, right? My grades were strong enough. I did the GRE and my grades were strong enough that I was accepted to Yale to do my PhD. And so I went, packed my bags, and sight unseen arrived in New Haven, where I completed my PhD in 6 years. And after that, I moved to UC Berkeley, where I did my postdoctoral fellowship. And a postdoctoral fellowship is what you do after you've completed your PhD. It's further training. And then here I am today as a professor at the University of Tennessee. So on paper, the route I took to go from high school to becoming a professor seems fairly straightforward. It looks very excellent, but I think a lot of it was just sheer luck on my part, but also taking advantage of every small opportunity that was available to me, okay? So what about my science journey now? So I actually really started to do science when I started my PhD. Most of my classmates in Yale had already had a lot of experience in the lab from when they were undergraduates and even in high school. Because I came from such a small country, I had not had any of that exposure. So I had to pick up pretty quickly a lot of the basic ideas that one learns as a young researcher, but nevertheless, I was fairly successful in my PhD. I published several papers. And the main thing I understood, I investigated, was the interaction between plant immune receptors, and this is a protein called N, like the letter N, and then a viral protein. Okay, so that there's this protein in a plant virus, and we call it P50. So I'm just giving a flavor of the sort of microscopy and plant assays that I did as a grad student, and I developed this brand new model for how these immune receptors work in the plant immune system, and that's still the model that people use today. So I did fairly good work. And I did my PhD from 2000 to 2006. So it took me 6 years to complete my PhD, and my advisor was Dr. Dinesh Kumar. He was at Yale then, now he is the chair of the Department of Plant Biology at UC Davis. So he's been very successful as well. So once I was finished at Yale, I moved to UC Berkeley, where I was a postdoctoral fellow. And there I switched my research a bit. I continued to work in plants, but I looked at intercellular trafficking in plants via these spores called plasmodesmata. And I had become interested in these plasmodesmata because of the previous work I had done on viruses. So viruses use plasmodesmata to spread through plants, but I became interested in how the pores themselves work. And I was able to make several important discoveries in this area. So I was very competitive when I started to apply for jobs. So I was a postdoc from 2007 to 2011, and I worked with Dr. Patricia Zabriskie at UC Berkeley. And then in January 2012, I started my job at the University of Tennessee, where I'm a professor. But in my scientific life, I'm actually a principal investigator, which means that on grants, I'm heading my own research projects, right? So I have my research portfolio that I direct grad students and postdocs myself, and I'm responsible for getting funding to pay them and to pay for the materials they need for their research. So I became an assistant professor in 2012. And in 2019, I was promoted to associate professor, which is what I am currently. So I will say, this is an image of my lab group. This is a few years old now on the right here. In this paper, in this figure, you can see this is Elena. She's a former postdoc in the lab. These three individuals were grad students. This is George. He was an undergraduate who worked in the lab for a long time. And this is Maria, who was a visiting scientist from Spain. So that was what the makeup of my lab looked like a few years back. So I was an assistant professor, and I was there for a fairly long time because I had several personal challenges while I was an assistant professor. And I'll tell you about them because they to show that, you know, life is not easy for anybody and that there are challenges that we have to meet and overcome. So while I was an associate professor, this was not a challenge. This was actually a good thing. I had my second daughter while I was an assistant professor. And then, excuse me, a few years after that, my husband passed away. So I had these challenges while I was an assistant professor. So I remained an assistant professor for a little longer because I had a lot on my plate to deal with. But at the end of it, it all worked out nicely, and I'm an associate professor, and hopefully I will remain one for a few more years before becoming a full professor. So, does anyone have any questions about that? Pretty straightforward. It's just descriptive of what I've done.
If you want to stop for a moment, I did just see a couple things in the chat.
Okay.
Do you want to go ahead and answer questions now, or is that okay?
Sure, I can answer now.
All right. This one from Lily. Lily, do you want me to read this, or do you want to ask it out loud? It's up to you. I'll take that as I'll ask it. Oh, go ahead. Okay. Lily said, what kind of cell structure, I don't know the correct term, does an animal need to be albino? I'm really interested in how something becomes albino, what animals become albino, and what animals can survive being albino.
Huh, that's an interesting question. So albinos tend to be, their cells are normal. What they lack is a pigment that gives them color. So they tend to be mutants that have a defect in their ability to make a pigment that gives them color. So I don't know if there's anybody in the room who knows more than that, but I think almost any animal can be albino. The problem is that a lot of times the pigment is necessary to absorb sunlight. And so if you don't have these pigments, you run into difficulty surviving very long. So you have a lot of DNA damage and you end up with a lot of related diseases. So that's what happens to albinos generally. Does that answer you, Lily? Okay. I'm a plant person, so, you know, I'm going out on a limb here. The same is true for albino plants. They don't do very well.
One more, before we move on, I'll ask
Sure.
one more question in the chat. I don't want to hold you up too much, but, and I don't know if I'm saying this right, so please correct me, but Iron or Aaron, Kim, what was it?
Erin, like ear, like your ear.
Gotcha, Aaron. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, like, what went through your mind and what you considered the most when you decided to decide to pursue a higher degree than just like a 4-year college experience? Like, what went into that thought process?
That's a great question. So for me, I had done my 4-year degree, but I still wanted to know more. I mean, the main thing driving me at that point was my curiosity. I had no real idea of what was possible with a science degree. I mean, I had been a high school teacher actually in between going to college and all of that. I taught high school and I loved teaching. So I thought I could continue studying more biology and then I could just keep teaching at a higher level. So that was actually what my primary goal was. I wasn't even aware there was a whole life of research and running your own lab. I mean, my experience was so narrow before I got to grad school that I didn't even know what the possibilities were for me. But all I knew is I wanted to know more and I wanted to teach. And that's why I decided to continue on to do my PhD. Yeah. Okay. So anybody else? Any questions? No? All right. So what does a professor do? I'm speaking for myself. I don't know about other professors. So, excuse me, I spend the bulk of my time doing research-related activities. And what do I mean by that? I mean, I spend a lot of time directing the research in my lab, helping students design experiments, correct experiments, analyze data. I spend a lot of time writing grants. I spend time reviewing grants, writing manuscripts, reviewing manuscripts. And I'm also an editor at multiple journals. So I spend quite a bit of time handling manuscripts, getting them reviewed. So I participate in peer review quite a bit, okay? And we can talk about what peer review is a little later. And then my amount of time I spend on teaching and related activities actually fluctuates depending on my course load for a semester. Sometimes as much as 30% of my time is spent preparing lectures and teaching, spend a lot of time meeting one-on-one with students. I should have said answering student emails. That's a huge chunk of time. But when I'm not teaching undergrads, I also serve on graduate students committees. So we read their theses or their reports and we have to give them feedback. And then you spend the rest of your time, however that's divided up, on service activities. So the university and the departments have a whole bunch of committees that help them keep them running. So I serve on some of those. I also do a lot of public outreach, which is like what I'm doing today, working with you guys. And I'm also involved with the deaf community. So getting deaf students involved in science, that's something that I do and my lab does, partly because I have a deaf graduate student in my lab. So she's really served as a conduit to make us aware of the needs for the deaf community related to science education. And I also serve on professional society activities. So currently I am the chair of the Science Policy Committee of the American Society for Plant Biologists, which is the largest organization of plant biologists probably in the world. And I direct the Science Policy Committee, which is actually the lobbying arm of the group. So lobbying Congress for money for plant science. That's what I'm in charge of this year. So I'll see how it goes. Okay, so that's what professors do. We have three big areas: research, teaching, and service. What advice would I offer to you young scientists? Well, I would say no matter what you want to do with your career, you need to make a plan, right? You need to have some goals, a reasonable set of goals that you want to achieve. So lay them out, make a plan for yourself. But at the same time, you need to be flexible, and your goal is always to be resilient, right? There's not one way, there's not one right way to get where you want to go. So when you make your plan, you say, this is my strategy A, but if A doesn't work out, then I'm going to take path B. And if B runs into trouble, then I can do C. And you have to realize that there are going to be setbacks, there's going to be failures, there are going to be things happening in your life, but you have to be resilient. Everybody talks about that. You have to be able to not let the world come crashing down on you and give up. So you need to be determined, okay? Science is not easy. It takes effort, it takes work, but you have to have some amount of determination, right? That's what you want to do. You have to be committed to it. I'll tell you, I wish somebody had told me how important math and statistics are. Even if you're not going to be a mathematician, statistics are very important for actually making sense of data and also for designing good experiments. So pay attention to math and statistics. Even if you're not a superstar, excuse me, they are the everyday tools that you actually need to be able to be a good scientist on the bench. All right, that I really wish somebody had told me that when I was in school, because I would have paid a lot more attention. Computer skills are highly encouraged. Nowadays, everybody is doing everything on computers. I'm a biologist, and I wish I knew how to do some basic programming. I have made a point of making sure my grad students are trained in this area because that's how everything is going. You have to have some ability to interface competently with software to move forward. So I would say, seriously, make sure you get yourself some computer skills. So science is all about creativity. So ask questions. Ask questions of others, ask questions of yourself. Have mentors. So I put this picture up here because this is like what people think of as a scientist, right? A crazy guy with wild hair, old white man, you know. I mean, what he's wearing to look at a microscope makes no sense, but that's the image people think of. And that's not what scientists look like. They look like everybody, every shape, size, age, color. I mean, a lot of the science is done by young people, not by old guys. No offense to anybody in the audience. I mean, no offense. I'm just saying the scientific workforce is made up of young people, right? People in their 20s and 30s. So, you know, but look for mentors. Look for people who are where you want to be, where you want to get, and take advice from them. You know, listen to their stories, their suggestions, think about what they've done and how it can be helpful to you. And the last thing I'll say is science is supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be the joy of discovery, learning something new, advancing an idea, interfacing with the natural world. I mean, you should be having fun at the end of the day, right? So people laugh at me a lot because when my students give me good news or good data, normally the professors all the way down the hall can hear me singing and screaming, and they're always like, we knew Tessa got something good because we could hear her yelling and screaming. But I mean, I really love what I do because I really love science, and the discovery is important. And I think it's passed on to my students. The problem I have now is they call me day and night to discuss their data. So, you know, sometimes at 9 o'clock at night, they'll call me and they're like, I'm on the microscope and it's beautiful. You know, and I'm half asleep, and I enjoy it, okay? All right, so that's my advice to you. Have fun with it, even though it can be challenging. So you wanted some tips on virtual research. So I'll tell you this, that in the virtual world, it's actually not a bad thing nowadays. There's lots of data and databases that are publicly available for you. And I've just given some examples here. So PubChem is a big database of all the chemical structures. I think Dr. Tompkins can tell us more about that, right? So you can go in there and find the structure of almost any chemical you want at this website. GenBank has all this genome sequence. Expacy is from the Swiss Academy, and it has all these protein structures and protein folds. And I'm narrowing down here. You have the Arabidopsis Information Research, which has a vast amount of information about Arabidopsis, which is the model plant system. And every model system has a database. So there's actually a lot you can do with virtually. You can actually find a lot of information online, and you can actually use a lot of tools that are publicly available to do a lot of analysis of this data. So being stuck at home and out of a lab is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not as bad as it would have been years ago, because there is all these virtual resources available that you could use. So you can have a very nice virtual science fair project. So just look for resources online and you'll be shocked by how many there actually are. Okay. So what can you do for high school students? How do you stay engaged in science? There are clubs at your middle and high school, and things like this virtual science club are great. There are all these regional and statewide competitions. I know of a few of them that I've listed right here. And then there's statewide programs like the Governor's School. You have it in different areas. Last year, Jason recruited me for the Governor's School in Science and Engineering and Technology, I believe. So there are a lot of opportunities available for you as a middle or high school student, but one you may not know about is independent research. You can actually be a volunteer in faculty labs. So in my own lab, almost every summer, I have an a high school student working in my lab independently, who's not part of any research program. I have high school students who simply email me and say, Dr. Burch-Smith, can I come to work in your lab this summer? And I say yes. So that's another opportunity that that's available to you. If you have a research opportunity nearby, just reach out to a professor by email you're interested in. You'd be surprised by how willing professors are to have high school students actually come and work in their labs. Okay, so that's another resource that you may want to consider, working in a lab. Even if you're washing dishes or making media or doing something small, you're surrounded by people talking about science, and you'd be surprised how much you learn just by doing that. Okay? So I've been speaking as a professor, which is what I am, but I've tried to keep the discussion also general. Like a degree in science can open a wide array of jobs to you. Okay, you're not limited to being a professor, excuse me, as I am. There are tons of jobs in industry, medicine, you're familiar with, engineering. But a lot of people with degrees in science go on to do jobs in law. The government always needs good scientists. And I, for one, am always trying to encourage people to get government jobs, being government scientists, because the science is only as good as what the government understands as and is willing to fund. And we have a lot of prominent examples right now with the pandemic, et cetera, and developing the vaccines and all of that. So government and policy is an important place for people with backgrounds in science. And of course, teaching. We need good science teachers so we can have people understanding science well. Another advantage of studying science, even if you don't go into a career in science, even if you just do a bachelor's in science, is that it teaches you how to think critically and how to process data, how to look at large amounts of data and make sense of them. And these are skills that are important to you, even if you're running your own business, right? If you decide that you have a degree in chemistry and you want to go and open a shoe store, being able to collect the data from your customers, analyze it, and pick out the trends is a skill that's going to be valuable anyway. So there's no real drawback to getting a degree in science in any way, shape, or form. And the last thing I want to say is that being interested in science doesn't mean that you can't also be interested in music or art, right? Scientists tend to be left brain, right brain people. A lot of scientists I know do science, but a lot of them also have a skill playing a musical instrument or being very talented in art. One of my grad students actually plays in one of the Knoxville symphonies, and he plays in there with one of the professors in our department. So he plays the clarinet, the flute, you name it, saxophone, and my colleague, the other professor, she plays the violin in the symphony. So they're scientists, but they do other things as well. So don't feel boxed in that if you're interested in science, that's all you have to do. I mean, diversity of thoughts and experience are really important because diverse ideas are how you get diverse ideas in the lab, and you can test different ideas and see what works, okay? So I think that's all I have for you today. And I'm happy to share any questions and discuss anything with you.
Tessa, before we move on to questions, number one, you're okay if we share these slides with the students? Is that all right?
Yes, that'll be fine.
Okay. So just all the students in the room, just so you know, we will put these slides online on the Virtual Science Club, the member page, and a recording of this presentation too. So if you need to go back and look at anything, or you need to check out some of those links for online research that Tessa put in there, just know that'll be on that website in probably the next 24 hours or so. Now, if you have questions about how to get there, you're more than welcome to email us, prep@utk.edu. But yeah, any questions for Tessa other than what's in the chat? I can read those out in just a minute, but any other general thoughts or questions? Grace, do you have your hand raised? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I joined on late, so what do you teach at the college?
What do I teach?
Yes.
I have taught a variety of courses. One class that I teach consistently is scientific communication. So I teach students how to talk about science. And I also teach courses. I've taught, molecular biology and genomics. I've taught advanced cell biology. I've taught experimental techniques to grad students. So basically I teach a lot of things related to molecular and cellular biology. That's my area of expertise. I am not a biochemist, but definitely cell and molecular biology.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm going to read out some. Oh, Trevor, you have a question?
Yeah. What made you want to teach science?
Because I just loved sharing. I love sharing science with students, right? I mean, everybody makes observations about the world they live in. And I like Lily asked earlier about albino creatures. That's an observation one makes. And I just loved sharing the information with people so that they could better understand the world they lived in. So I've always enjoyed that. And I love interacting with students because you guys can be so insightful. You know, I think about a problem one way for 2 years, and then a student will ask me a question, and all of a sudden, I start thinking about it a different way. And that's what I mean about the diversity in thought. You know, if everybody thinks about the problem the same way, we don't think of different ways to solve it. So for me, that's what I enjoy about being in the classroom. Is the students come with all these different ideas, and people like y'all are young and unencumbered by the burden of a PhD. So you are much freer to speak your mind and your ideas, and you don't think, oh boy, that sounds off the wall, so I'll just shut up and say nothing. I mean, you guys just let it rip, and you know, most times you're right. So I really like that.
Nathan, Aaron has a really good question in the chat.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and read that one. So think it back to when you were talking about reaching out to professors to be a volunteer in their lab virtually.
Yes.
Aaron is wondering, when you reach out, is there anything specific to include when asking a professor? What would you, if you were writing that email, what would you say?
You will tell the professor how much experience you've had in an area. So if you're going to talk to a professor in physics, you should tell him, well, I have done 1 or 2 years of physics, or I've taken AP physics, or I've taken honors physics or regular physics, that sort of thing. So that information is probably most helpful in helping the professor decide whether or not you would be a good fit in the lab, you know? So stuff like I'm a junior in high school, or I'm a rising sophomore, and I just want to come to the lab, volunteer for a few days, you know, learn more about what you work. I plan to take physics next semester. All that sort of information is helpful to the professor. So right away, they can see how they could fit you into what is going on in the lab at the time, or design something that can accommodate you. That's a good question. Excellent. Thanks.
We've got another good question from Irene. And I think this one's especially important because some of these students may be looking to do science projects for the science fair. So kind of think of it that way too. But how did you, Irene is asking, how did you choose what field of science you want to specialize in?
At the risk of sounding really corny, I will say biology chose me. No. Once you start doing a bunch of courses in science, you know which one you have a natural affinity for, right? I mean, I'm sure every scientist in here will say, I just always preferred the numbers part of it, so I was drawn towards maths or physics, or I always loved the computers, so I went to computer science. For me, it was always biology. In particular, I'm interested in communication. So for me, that's what I've studied, how organisms communicate with each other, and how, you know, plant cells communicate with each other. That's my main interest. So by exposure to different areas, you start to figure out what it is you really like and what really interests you. So the same thing, you're thinking of your projects for the science fair, put down a whole bunch of questions that you can think of. And the one that you're genuinely interested in, even if you may not be sure how to go about doing the project, but the one that really captures your excitement may be the one that you really want to do. Does that help? Yeah? Okay. All right.
She says yes, thank you.
Okay.
Another popped up from Lily, and she's wanting to know what if the job you want is outside of a lab, so not necessarily research in a lab. What would you recommend there?
Excuse me. Do you mean as a high school student?
I'm not sure. Lily, can you maybe tell us just a little more?
I'm not entirely sure. Just like as a job in general, like it's getting a degree in science and then going out into the world, like traveling to research on a different animal or something.
Yeah, that's completely possible. I mean, there are research expeditions that hire people on in different capacities. That's a perfectly valid career path that you could definitely follow. I mean, a lot of my students, and when I say my students, I mean undergrads, a lot of them work in companies, in industry. Even here in Knoxville, there are several industries where they do things like quality control of products. Some of them go to agricultural companies, some go to research companies. So there are a lot of different jobs that you can do. You can go on, work at a zoo, these sorts of places. I know for example, the body farm at UT takes a lot of volunteers. It's hard to get in, but they do have several people who work there doing their anthropology and pathology studies. So there are a lot of different options available. I mean, a degree in science is almost, you can do almost anything with it. Couldn't teach French, but you could definitely do a lot of things with it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
Erin, you have another question?
Just a quick question. I was wondering what like a current virtual volunteering in a lab looks like, because I know it might be harder to, actually go into a lab in person.
Yeah, so what a virtual project would look like now. So I have an undergrad, actually a couple undergrads who are doing virtual projects with me this semester because it's hard to get into the lab. And what I have them doing is a bunch of sequence analysis. So I'm a biologist, so they're doing a whole bunch of genetic analysis, trying to identify these genes. Are they in the pathway? How far back in evolution can we find the genes? Are they, they're in plants, but do we see them in cyanobacteria? Do we see them in moss? How related are the protein sequences? What are the common features? So a lot of computer-based stuff can be done virtually. I mean, even this summer for the governor's school, I made Jason's life miserable because I was putting stuff in the mail to send to my students. So I would mail the students reagents and they would have to do the experiments at home. So that's an actual possibility that you could be at home doing experiments with things that somebody has sent you. So you just need to ask. It doesn't hurt to ask, right? If they tell you no, what have you lost? The 3 minutes it took to send the email. Yeah, so go for it.
She really did make me send plant seeds and soil to all these kids in the mail. So it was fun though.
Yeah, so where there's a will, there's a way. Anybody else? Yes, Grace?
Is there a particular reason you chose to go into a STEM field?
No, I just simply loved science. That was all it was for me. And like I said in my presentation, I wonder sometimes if I had grown up in a different country where I actually had models for what a scientist looked like, would I have been so gung-ho about becoming a scientist? I mean, I grew up where there were no scientists, no university, nothing. But I just figured I want to be one of these people writing the children's books, telling everybody what science is and does. So I didn't see it as something that couldn't be done, right? I just figured that I wanted to be a scientist, so I would go ahead and be one. And so I went, and my options were fairly limited, I will confess, because my university was so small. It's not like there were, you know, high-level physics colliders available to us. I mean, my labs were so rudimentary. I look back and it's a kind of embarrassed to think about, you know, when I thought I was working in a lab, what I was actually doing. But I got enough book learning so that when I got to Yale, I was able to keep up with my classmates and eventually pass them. So, I mean, I just wanted to know more about how the world worked. And biology was just the thing that drew me. I mean, I kept up with chemistry for a long time, but then when it came time to go to grad school, I needed to make a choice. And I decided to go with biology. Yeah. Just kind of ironic, right? I sent out applications, and I mean, in their wildest dreams, why would I sit down in St. Lucia and apply to an Ivy League school? I mean, that's how naive I was, right? That I was like, I've heard of Yale University, I'm going to apply there. And when I get here, I realize everybody's like, Yale, woo! And I'm like, oh, it's a big deal, okay? Yeah, oh, I'm important, I'm at Yale. But before, I mean, I had just heard of Yale, you know, it was on TV shows, people went to Yale and Harvard, but I didn't know how to download the Harvard application because I didn't know about PDF files. So apparently I downloaded hundreds of the files for Harvard, but didn't know how to open them. So I never applied to Harvard, but I applied to Yale and Columbia because these were the schools I knew. And luckily, you know, Yale accepted me, sight unseen. So take a chance, you know. Like I said, if they tell you no, what have you lost? Nothing. And you might get a yes, you know?
That's some good advice. We have about 5 minutes left, so definitely still a few questions we can take if anyone has any. But I did want to, I wanted to ask you, Tessa, is there some sort of, did you do any science projects when you were, say, like middle school or high school? Did you do anything like that? And if so, could you share one of those experiences?
Oh my God, this is probably one of the saddest chapters of my life. But yes, I did a project. And again, at the risk of sounding like, I did a project on rats in a housing project. So I actually went out with my best friend. She was one of the girls in the pictures I showed. And we actually did a survey of rats. I mean, look, there's no university, there's nobody to guide me. I wanted to do a science fair project. So I figured I would just go out and count how many rats I could find in the housing project and how big the rats were and what time of day the rats, I mean, it was disgusting. But the problem is the local, well, not the local, the national news, everything is so small in St. Lucia. Man, I was interviewed on the national news for my project about rats. I must have been about 12 or 13 at the time. So everybody started calling me like the rat girl. So everybody knew me there. I would walk around the streets and people say, hey, look, the girl about the rats. So that was my first foray into science. And after that, I decided maybe I would do something a little more low-key instead of that. But I mean, I used what was available to me, and that was basically all I could do was count. So I counted rats. I had nice models of rats for my fair. I built a scale model of the housing projects using all my maths, and I made prisms and all of that. So I used, you know, a lot of science in there, but, you know, that's what I had. It was fun. I must tell my friend about this. I must remind her about that.
think we have time for maybe one more question. If anybody has any final questions for Tessa tonight.
So Lily has a question in the chat about just how good you need to be with computers. Excuse me, you don't need to be a whiz with computers at this stage. All you need to be is open-minded about using them in your research. As you continue along in your career, you pick up skills, but you just need to be aware that the skills are good to have. You don't need to have any specific training per se, right? So now being comfortable using Excel, Word, PowerPoint, nobody wants more than that. But if you can pick up something else, that would be great. Just don't develop a distaste for computers. Yeah.
Well, on behalf of everyone with the fair, Tessa, I just want to say thank you for being here tonight and answering questions and just sharing your experience. We really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. It was lots of fun, and I wish you all the best. Like Jason says, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me directly by email. All right. And thank you to the organizers for putting this together. This is a great idea.
Thank you, Tessa. And Jan or Kim, do you want to say any final words to close tonight?
I'm sorry, who did you ask, Jason?
You or Jan, either. Yeah.
Okay. No, Tessa, thank you so much for those words. I have to reiterate, sometimes you figure out what you want to do because you find out that you really love part of what you're studying and you don't like some of the other things as much. So you figure it out. Also, I'd like to also say that never turn your back on being able to get a little bit more training on computer. It will help you out in the long run. So, yes, anybody has any questions about the science fair per se, about their science fair project, Jason and I, Jen, will stay on for a while. And, but I'm really, really thrilled for those of you who asked questions tonight. It was fantastic to get to see what you were thinking. So I guess until next time.
Bye all.
All right, next meeting November 17th. Just FYI, November 17th. Write that down.
Bring your project ideas with you and questions.